Hey everybody, it's Pete from MyJewelryBlends.com. Today I'm going to be working on this Breitling watch. I've actually already gone and done the full service to the watch, and I forgot to film that, so I'm actually just going to be filming the assembly of this watch. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share. And if you have any comments to make them in the comment section below, and if you have any questions, please leave them there. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get started with the assembly of this 2800 series ETA movement that's in this beautiful Breitling watch. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the clutch system. I've already gone and started the assembly, so the surface of the main plate has actually been reassembled. So I've got the cannon pinion in place. All the clutch gears or clutch levers are actually all set. So it's just a matter of getting these gears in position. They can be a little tricky, so just take your time when you're working with these. And as I assemble this, I actually do testing, so I'll test it and make sure that everything works fine before I go on to the next step, which is to assemble the train. So there you can see I'm putting the motor barrel in, or the mainspring barrel, whichever you prefer to call it. And I'll just keep going with the assembly. And I'm going to assemble this from bottom side up. So whatever gear goes in its lowest position, I'll start with that gear. So here's the third gear, or the third wheel, so we're getting that in position. And I'm being very careful here. I know you guys are going to complain that I'm being rough with these watches, but I'm pretty delicate with these. It looks worse on film than it does in person. Next thing, we'll put the second hand wheel in and get that seated correctly. You'll notice on my pad I have a hole in the center of that pad so that everything kind of protrudes into that hole so I don't do any damage. Once the train is in position, I'll get the train bridge and get that seated correctly. And this will take a little finagling. Every watch is a little bit different, but ETA movements, they'll eventually seat into place. And what I do is I just kind of turn these gears until I find out which one's loose, and I'll just tinker around with it until I get it to seat in the jewel correctly. So once the staff is seated in the jewel, I'll go ahead and grab one of the two screws that holds this bridge in position, and I'll tighten that down very, very loosely so that I can still go ahead and test the train and make sure that the train is functioning fully. Again, you can see I still have a loose wheel here, so I'm just going to keep getting these seated and moved into position correctly. Once in a while, depending on the size of the watch, like ladies' watches, I'll usually bring those under the microscope just to make sure that I've got those seated correctly. Once the train is in position, I'll go ahead and make sure that the screws for the bridge are tightened up. And here I'm working on the second screw for that train bridge. ETA movements are pretty easy to work on. I say they are second only to a good Rolex 3000 series movement as far as ease of service. Now here I'm putting a little oil on, and if I do get any extra oil on there, I will definitely wipe it off. I usually use like a pith wood or some kind of a wooden stick to soak up some of the oil. Then we'll get the hack into position. This hack integrates to the one of the clutch gears, and when you pull the stem out, it'll kind of move that hack over to the balance and stop the watch from running. 99.9% of the time, that is always in the second click position. I'll get that barrel bridge in place. So the barrel bridge kind of holds the barrel down, it holds the hack in position. And again, we're going to tighten these screws down, not quite all the way. I do want to leave them a little loose so that I can go ahead and test things and make sure that everything works smoothly. Once I've tested everything, I'll move on to the second and third screws for the barrel bridge. And as you're doing this, go ahead and make sure that the stem and crown and clutch system works correctly. Test that periodically as you're moving forward with this part, just to make sure that you didn't accidentally move something out of position, or if one of those clutch gears slips out, you will have to take that bridge apart or remove it again to fix or make an adjustment. Here we'll get the ratchet wheel in for the barrel, and that's pretty simple to get in place. And I'm just going to give this a little turn. On this particular watch, the ratchet does not directly connect to the barrel gear or the winding gear on the barrel. We'll tighten this down. And I'm just looking to make sure that the train is moving correctly and that it's free, and If I hear any issues with the mainspring, I'm going to find them right there. Next thing, I'll turn it over and I'll do the top side of the main plate and oil in any jewels that need to be oiled. Again, if you over oil these, you can get a pithwood stick and just pick up some of that oil. Now we'll get the setting gear in position. This is the first setting gear. There are 2 setting gears for this particular model watch. And here's the second one. Now this gear here is the set gear for the date ring. So that's an articulated gear that moves in and out and only sets the date in one position. Atom movements are pretty nice. The date rings snap in pretty easily. Once we get the date ring in position, then we're going to put the little plate back on over the set gears, and that holds the set wheels and set gears in position. Gently tighten this screw, and that's going to hold in the set gears, the date ring, and you're all set to go on to the next step. Now that that's tightened down, I'm just going to give this a quick test and make sure that the date ring and the winding system work perfectly. Again, I do constant testing. So here you can see the date ring is switching perfectly, and if I reverse turn the crown, it will not change the date, just like so. So it only changes in one direction. Let's move on to the pallet fork. Now again, I always tell you guys that the pallet fork is very, very delicate, so be very careful with it. You can easily break off those 2 jewels on the tips of the pallet fork. You could break the staff. It's very easy to do. A little harder to crack the jewel in there, but you just want to handle this with extreme caution. I take my time when I'm working with a pallet fork on any particular watch. So once I get that pallet fork in place, you can see the pinion and the staff of that fork will just fit into the jewel finally, and it allows me to move on to the bridge for it. This pallet bridge has 2 screws holding it down and 2 alignment pegs. So we'll get that into position, and I'm going to work with this very, very carefully. And I'm going to put in 1 screw only, and I'm going to tighten that down about 2/3 of the way so that the bridge is still loose and is not holding the pallet fork, so that I can just kind of tinker with that pallet fork and make sure it gets seated correctly in the jewel. So you can see it's still a little loose, and I'm just going to make little adjustments to the level of the pallet fork until it gets seated correctly. Once it's seated correctly, you'll notice that bridge will just kind of push down into place without any interruptions, and then I can see that it is seated correctly. Once that's done, I'll tighten up that first screw. Again, before I continue tighten, I always check to make sure that there's no friction on the pallet fork. Once it's in place, I'll put the second screw in. I usually back off these screws and then get them to fit correctly, and you'll see it's pretty easy at that point. Okay, we're going to give this a little bit of oil just to make sure that it's lubed up. And now on to my favorite part, which is getting the balance wheel put back in. So I've got the bridge here, it's holding the balance. Atom movements have really wonderful, nice tensile strength hairsprings, and they just seem to last forever. Once we get that working, then I'll listen for the click. And once it's happy, I'm going to put the balance bridge screw in. I'm going to give this a test, so I'll wind it about maybe 3 or 4 times. Make sure that it's moving correctly, and then it's off to the timing machine. And that's where I like to do most of my testing. I'll spend probably 15 minutes just adjusting the time to make sure everything's correct. On these atom movements, you can get these down to, a couple seconds, even the older ones, sometimes within this particular one I got under a second per day, so that was pretty good. So here you can see I just loosened up the dial feet clamps, and I'm putting in the dial spacers. So there are 2 openings in the dial spacer, and those fit in with those dial holes in the frame of the watch. Make sure that they're aligned correctly, because the dial feet for the dial have to go through this dial spacer into the frame of the watch. Once that's done, we'll place the dial back on the watch. going to gently flip this over. Make sure your pad is clean, and then we're going to tighten up the clamps for the dial feet. Get the first one done, and we'll grab that second one. Now that it's tightened, I'm going to flip this over. I'm going to look at it and just make sure that the hour wheel, the minute wheel, and the second hand post are protruding correctly from the dial. I've already gone and set this to the midnight position, so I can put the hour hand on the watch. Now here I'm using a hand tool. I'll put a link in the description below where you can get these. I'm going to tighten down that hour hand. I'm going to line it up directly to the 12 o'clock position. And now I'll move on to the minute hand. Again, I'm using the same tool for the minute hand that I used for the hour hand. There are two different sizes on either end of that tool. So I'm going to push that down, make sure that it's seated correctly, and then we're going to test and make sure that the hour hand and minute hand don't touch any part of the dial nor each other. Once I'm satisfied with the fact that they're level, I'm just going to rotate this around 24 hours to test and see what time the date actually changes. If I'm really far off, which you can be sometimes, remember there's a difference in the date changing, whether it's happening automatically or manually. And what I'm looking for is I'm trying to get within like 30 minutes of 15 minutes on either side of midnight for that date to change. Once that's done, the next step is to make sure and prepare your case is ready. I'm going to remove the crown and stem from the movement. On this particular model, the 2800 series, you got a little push pin for the clutch, and it's going to release that. Just be very careful. You don't want to push that too far, or you can release all those little springs for the clutch system. I'll get the second hand in place, and I have a second dial or a hand tool that has a flat surface, a flat vinyl surface. We're going to push that second hand into position. Make sure that it's tight. And now I also want to let that run a complete minute just to make sure that there's no interference with the second hand nor the minute hand. Any adjustments can be made at this point. Okay, so I've put the movement back into the watch, and now I'm going to line it up, and I'm going to prepare myself for the stem and crown insertion for this particular watch. Sometimes you'll be putting the holding ring in first. Sometimes you put the stem and crown in first, so it really depends on what kind of a holding ring you're using for your particular movement. So I'm going to kind of get this started, then I'll push that pin in very, very gently and just insert the stem all the way into the movement. Again, be careful because you don't want to push that pin too far in. Otherwise, you could release all the little levers in that clutch system. Once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and do a full test. So I'm going to do a winding and setting test of the stem and crown and make sure that everything works perfectly. Okay, so now we're off to the spacer. This is the spacer ring that Breitling includes with this particular model watch, so we'll just get that lined up correctly. This has 4 positions for screws to hold it in place. For instance, we have to screw down the movement to the spacer ring and make sure that it's lined up correctly. And we also have to make sure that the spacer ring can screw down to the actual case itself. So here we're going to get the 2 screws that hold the movement to the spacer ring in place. This is screw 1. And then screw 2. Now I typically don't tighten these all the way down until I've got both of them in position and everything's lined up correctly, and then I'll tighten them completely. Okay, so once those are tightened up, we'll move on to the case screws. On this particular model Breitling, there are 3 clamps and 3 screws that go into the spacer ring and hold the ring onto the case. That way, if you flip it over or upside down, there's no play, there's no looseness, everything's tightened up. So here you can see I put the first clamp in and I'm attaching the first screw into the spacer ring. And that's going to hold position 1, or one of the 3 positions on this particular model. I'm going to tighten that down. We're going to move on to the second location. We'll get the screw put in. Sometimes you may have to tinker with these depending on the angle of the clamp. And again, that also has to do with the manufacturing of the case. Sometimes these can be a little fidgety, so just take your time, be cautious. And I'm going to work on the last clamp here, and again, this is near the balance wheel, so use extreme caution because you don't want to drop these on the balance wheel, which could cause some damage to the balance of the watch. Okay, so all three clamps are tightened down and ready. So it's off to the winding system. Now, I typically put the winding systems on once the movement is cased in the watch case because I just prefer to do it that way. And here you can see I'm just oiling the three jewels on the bottom of the winding system for this set of movement, and now I'll move on to the top. Everything's been cleaned and ready to assemble. So most ETA movements have a nice keying system to them, and normally there's only one position you can get these into, so just line it up the way it came out. There are two screws usually on ETA movements. They are almost always different colors, either black or blue, and those indicate the two screws that hold the winding system into the movement itself. So you can see these are, while they're stainless steel, they are anodized. We'll tighten those down, and we're just going to make sure that everything, all the gears are in place. I like to go through and do a little manual winding with the stem. And then once that's done, I'll put the rotor on. In this case, the rotor is not keyed, but it does clamp down with that screw. So one thing that you have to be careful with of the 2800 series, because it's not keyed, you have to make sure that screw is tight enough to hold the rotor in place, but not too tight that you could break the screw. And I do not recommend using any kind of a Loctite material in this because you could drip it onto the bearings and cause problems, as well as make it very, very difficult for the next guy, who could possibly be me, has to take this out. We'll make sure that it's free. If it's free and clear of the movement, we're in good shape and we can move on. So in this case, I'll change the gaskets, put the back cover back on, and we'll tighten it up. Now remember, most Breitlings have these funky little backs. You need special tools for these. I have a variety of several $100s worth of openers for Breitling watches. Sometimes they work perfectly, sometimes they don't. So let's go ahead and set the time and date on this particular model watch. You can see the hack's working. When I pull the crown out to the second position, it does stop the balance from running. And we're just going to move forward. And you can see it's a little after noon here. And I'm just going to set the date. Once that's done, we're going to go ahead and do a test of this watch. Again, if you like this video, guys, please give it a thumbs up and like, subscribe, and share if you're not already a subscriber. If you have any comments, leave them in the comments section below. And if you have any questions or would like to see specific videos, please let me know in that same description below. Thanks for watching and have a great day. I hope you enjoyed this video.